My name is Richard Sandbrook. I'm the president for Science for Peace and also the moderator today. And I should warn you in advance that this is the first occasion on which we've used the webinar mode of Zoom, and we don't have technical backup in this organization. So there may be glitches, and I hope you'll be patient with us. The Science for Peace Symposium in the fall term is entitled Working for the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. And the first webinar, as you know, provides an update on global campaigns to eliminate nuclear weapons. And then the second link webinar on November the 19th concerns Canadian efforts to ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So we have one speaker, Ray Acheson, who will speak for about 15 minutes. And Ray is very highly qualified. He's director of Reaching Critical Will, which is a disarmament arm of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. He's a member of various steering committees that coordinate global coalitions on anti-war topics. She's a leading figure in ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And ICAN, of course, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. She's won several awards for her work at the global level, has published dozens of articles on various aspects of warfare and nuclear weapons, and also has two books soon to appear on these subjects. So I think we'll all agree that Ray is superbly qualified to address us on the global efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. Before I call on Ray, however, I would like to say a few words about the format of this webinar. Ray, as I've mentioned, will address us for about 15 minutes. Then each of three panelists will pose one prepared question to Ray, and that will leave 20 minutes at the end for Ray to respond to questions from those in the audience. And please, if you want to ask a question, pose it via Q&A, which you'll find, at least on my screen, at the bottom and in the middle. Don't use chat, use Q&A. It directs the questions to the panelists. I will then pose whatever questions we have or we have time for to Ray in the final 20 minutes. So please remember Q&A, and also remember that we're going to stop directly at 3 p.m. as this is a 1-hour webinar. So now let me call on Ray to give us an update on the global efforts. Ray.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks to everybody that helped organize this today. The timing couldn't be more perfect. We had no idea when we set this up for today that just 2 days before we would receive the 50th ratification on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this is a really monumental turn for the treaty and for nuclear abolition. It means that we have enough ratifications now for the treaty to enter into force, which is going to happen on the 22nd of January. So we're going to have lots of actions planned for that day, and hope, of course, that everyone in Canada can really put pressure on the Trudeau government on that day, but we can discuss that more later on. I think it's really important to really celebrate this moment, especially because we're at a time when we're confronted with so many crises, and it seems like there's no good news in the world. And so it is, I think, important to turn to activism for our good news. The efforts of people in response to the pandemic by setting up mutual aid networks, or in response to the police brutality that we're seeing in the US where I'm living right now, or the re-amplified violence against Indigenous communities in Canada, and the responses by those who are resisting and confronting and challenging the power of states that resort all the time to violence, that do not invest enough in our care as citizens or just as human beings of the world. It's really important to look to these moments, these small moments of victory, I think, and to really hold on to them and honor the people that have contributed so much of their lives to this work over generations. And so I think in my kind of intro remarks, the questions are really great that have been prepared, but in my intro remarks, I just wanted to focus more on what's been happening recently with the treaty in particular. And so in addition to securing these 50 ratifications, we of course have many more that are near complete. So we're not ending with 50. Those numbers will be climbing. Signatures will also be coming in for the treaty, which is great. We're right now in the middle of the UN General Assembly's Committee on Disarmament, the first committee. And so we're tracking what governments are saying there as well. And it's been really interesting to see the ways in which the support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has really been amplified this year at the General Assembly. And it's probably partly due to the growing numbers of ratifications and what until Saturday was the impending entry into force. But we're really seeing an outpouring of support in the face of continued pressure from the nuclear armed states. Many of you probably saw last week that the Associated Press reported that the US government sent a letter to all of the countries that had ratified the treaty already, telling them that they made a strategic error and asking them to withdraw from the treaty. So this is, as far as we know, quite unprecedented. We're not aware of any other instance in which governments have called on others to withdraw from a treaty in this way. Usually at that level, there is concern with things like state sovereignty, which we might not care much about, but governments seem to. And so for one government to say that to another is incredibly, it's really outrageous, and it's really patronizing and patriarchal, and it's also quite racist because most of the countries that have so far ratified are from the global south. There's a few Europeans, but mostly not. And to suggest that they didn't know what they were signing up to or that they made some kind of mistake, it's just really incredible behavior, but consistent with the pressure that the nuclear armed states, particularly the US, France, and the UK, have put on countries to not join this treaty. They tried to oppose this treaty's negotiation and then tried to prevent states from joining it. And now to call on them to withdraw, it's just really the latest in a long line of ridiculous behavior that is actually quite revealing to us. It shows us how scared the nuclear armed states are of this treaty. They say that it is an irrelevant treaty. They say it will have no impact on their policy. They say that they will never join this treaty, which is quite something for so-called democracies to say, that they can set their policy in stone forever. And they say that it will never result in the elimination of a single nuclear weapon, and on they go about how ineffectual this will all be, and how dangerous it is to the non-proliferation regime. But in reality, they're very worried that this treaty is going to have the stigmatizing normative effects that we in ICANN and the other non-nuclear countries that we worked with have always said it will have. We could see that fear in the letter that the Obama administration sent to NATO allies ahead of negotiations, demanding that they not participate, where it outlined in great detail the impacts that this treaty will have on NATO nuclear sharing and nuclear war planning if any NATO state joins the treaty. So they know full well what's going to happen as time goes on. And we can already see NATO states starting to crack under the pressure. Just a few weeks ago, ICANN, led by ICANN Australia, coordinated a joint letter of former officials from nuclear umbrella states, so the NATO states, as well as South Korea, Japan, and Australia, getting over 50 former foreign ministers and prime ministers and other high-level officials from governments past in these countries to support the treaty and call on their governments, their current governments, to join it. So that was a really incredible showing from leaders. There was many Canadians that were on that letter, and other high-level officials, including 2 former Secretary Generals of NATO itself. So really amazing to watch the narrative shift happening before our eyes. We said this could happen. We were told that it couldn't happen, but now it is happening. And now that the treaty is going to enter into force in January, I think we're going to see more and more of this type of progress, which is always difficult to predict and sometimes difficult to measure, but it is happening. We've also been continuing our divestment initiatives to get nuclear weapon producers defunded by pension funds and banks and by all of you as individuals. I know that many of you in the Canadian community of anti-nuclear organizers have been working on divestment in Canada, so that's great. And I think we're going to see more of that now that the treaty is legally entering into force as well. Several of the big pension funds, like in the Netherlands, have cited the treaty as their reason for withdrawing their funds. So I think once it's in force, that will become even easier to convince these types of financial institutions to act. We're also continuing with the ICANN cities appeal in all of the states that don't currently support nuclear weapons. So this includes Canada. Several cities across Canada have joined the ICANN cities appeal. And basically that's just a matter of getting your mayor or your city council, even better, to adopt a resolution saying they endorse the treaty and call on the government to join. In some cases, like here in New York City, where I'm living, we've been working with city council to not just support the treaty, but to also divest the city's pension funds from nuclear weapon producing companies. And so that has been stalled a bit by the pandemic, getting that through, but we have enough of majority in city council to support that legislation once they get back to the regular docket of work. So yeah, there's a lot of really great actions going on, both at the global levels and at the local levels. And it's a really exciting time, I think, to be working on nuclear abolition, but also to be mindful of how our movement and our work really connects to so many of the other social movements that we're seeing right now active in Canada and the US and in many other countries. Movements against police brutality and for the abolition of police and prisons, abolition of war, abolition of borders, connecting all of these things that are really the structures of violence that categorically oppress us as people, that categorize us, that sort human beings, that incarcerate people, that kill people. And looking at all of this as a collective effort, our efforts in the anti-nuclear community, connecting up to these other movements against the structures of violence and oppression, and really finding new and innovative ways to work together. I think there's just so many opportunities right now to do that, and to really advance all the shifting narratives about power and privilege, and who gets to be considered credible and whose voices need to be amplified in this moment and beyond. So I think I'll stop there, and happy to take the prepared questions and any other questions about ICANN's work or Wolf's work.
Thank you very much, Ray. So we have 3 prepared questions, and the first one is by Julieta Vargas. Julieta has been with Science for Peace since early September, and she is our nuclear weapons campaigner. And Julieta did her master's degree at the University of Toronto and has worked for several non-governmental organizations. So Julieta, please pose your question.
Yes, thank you. So Ray, the first question is regarding how the feminist theory intersects with the denuclearization movement. So, well, according to the United Nations Women, the chances of a peace agreement lasting 15 years increases by 35% when women participate meaningfully in this peace process. So, I mean, it seems that lasting peace requires feminist perspective, and yet women have been excluded from discussions regarding security, conflict, peace building processes. So the question specifically is, how do you think the feminist theory intersects with the denuclearization movement?
Yeah, thank you very much, Julieta. I think this is a really important point. The exclusion of women from disarmament processes, discussions, negotiations, it's still very extreme. At the UN First Committee, during our general debate, only about 25%, maybe less, were women that were speaking at that event. And that's just in terms of people reading statements out in the General Assembly. This isn't even getting into the, the realm of making decisions about policy. So it's still a marked exclusionary space. But I think it's also important to remember that including women doesn't necessarily mean we're including feminist perspectives. And the thing with the numbers of what makes it so important is that it helps shift what's considered credible within these spaces. Many women that do advance into systems of power become constrained by those same systems in order to survive within it, which is why feminist theory is so relevant, because it deconstructs the notion that participation on its own is meaningful. It tells us that, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, who's a Black feminist, that we can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. We need the numbers of participation in order to help transform the thinking and what's allowed to be said within these spaces of power. But it's important that we're not just focused on that, and that we're not reinforcing also at the same time a gender binary, but we need to look instead about how to change what the ideas and the approaches are that are considered credible and meaningful, and whose voices count within these processes. So for us in the anti-nuclear movement, this has meant amplifying women, queer, indigenous, and survivor voices as absolutely essential to advance abolition, not as just important to have in the room, but as important to be part of the discussions about policy and strategy. In order to look at things from the non-hegemonic, the non-dominant position, which is really, that position is so invested in the idea that nuclear weapons bring security and the things that the small group of people has told us is the gospel truth, when in reality it's just a theory. So feminism is a lot about deconstructing these dominant narratives, and then also advancing alternatives that are really based in the lived reality of people, based on their experiences in the world. And it's about looking at the actual material reality of nuclear weapons, which is catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences, rather than just accepting abstract theories about security and deterrence.
Thank you, Julieta and Ray. Now we move on for the final two questions to our two superb interns on nuclear weapons, beginning with Nicholas Lovrics, who is a fourth-year undergraduate specializing in international relations. Nicholas.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for speaking with us today. So my question concerns some of the more stubborn nuclear states. We see that of the 9 nuclear states, 4 do not recognize the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, those being Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. In these countries, we can really see that issues of national security are of particular importance to their respective domestic and foreign policies. And furthermore, the threat of a nuclear strike or retaliation as a means of deterrence has governed much of the India-Pakistan relationship, the Arab-Israeli relationship, and much of North Korea's relationship with the rest of the world. So given this apparent ubiquity of nuclear weapons, how can the anti-nuclear movement make inroads in these respective political cultures? How would your organization attempt to alter the perception of nuclear weapons as being a necessity?
Yeah, really good question. Thank you. I can't speak too much to the North Korean situation. It's a little bit of a unique case, but in India, Pakistan, and Israel, we do have many anti-nuclear activists who've been engaged in this issue for decades, and they really do focus on exactly what you said, which is changing the narratives around the security perception of nuclear weapons. So in Israel, I would encourage you and anyone else that's interested to check out the Israeli disarmament movement, which is a partner of ICANN. And they've held a lot of different public actions over the years in order to draw attention to Israel's nuclear arsenal, which is very, very difficult to talk about in Israel publicly. Everything has to be cited according to foreign sources to do their work, but they've held actions against the bombing of Iran over its nuclear program, when a few years ago it looked like that was a near threat. They've done some public actions and debates around Dimona, the Israeli nuclear facility. They even once stripped naked in parliament in order to get media attention, because it was the only way that the media would cover them. And they were successful in doing that. Not necessarily advocating that in general, but it worked for them in the moment. And one of the approaches they take is really to talk about Israeli nuclear weapons in the context of the broader Middle East challenges with weapons of mass destruction, and to look at it as a regional issue that needs to be solved collectively. So the Israeli disarmament movement is one of the leaders in a different project called Middle East Treaty Organization, METO, M-E-T-O. And that's led by an Israeli and an Iranian working together to champion for the Middle East weapon of mass destruction free zone. And they're campaigning for all countries in the region to establish it. So Israel and the US have been opposed to this. They say rhetorically they're committed in principle, but they boycott discussions around it and block progress at the Non-Proliferation Treaty and at the UN. But all of the Arab states and Iran support it in principle. Of course, there's a lot of issues with WMD in the region that need to be resolved, but the point and the approach that they're taking is that this can be dealt with collectively. So trying to include Israel in the community within the Middle East, and countering entrenched narratives within Israel around this. And then in India and Pakistan, peace activists try to highlight, of course, the dangers of escalation of conflict with nuclear weapons being involved. And the waste of money on these weapons as well. There's been a lot of important work done over the years by South Asian activists, some of them that I would suggest looking up, and I can send you the names later if it's easier, but Acheson Vinayak, Arundhati Roy, who many of you are probably familiar with her work. She has written very eloquently about nuclear weapons and against India's possession of the bomb. M.V. Ramana, Zia Mian, Kukum Sangari. She wrote a great piece about why women must reject nuclearization in India back around the time of the tests that India conducted. So there has been a lot of really good work and organizing there, and also not just against nuclear weapons in India, but also against nuclear power. And so there's, yeah, I think that a lot of it has to do with transforming narratives around security and around what money should be spent on.
Thanks, Nicholas and Ray. At this point, I should remind the audience that we welcome your questions. So do now use the Q&A function to pose questions, which I will be asking of Ray following the next speaker's questions. So the final panelist is our second intern, Pitasanna Shanmugathas, and Pitasanna is a second-year master's student in the Masters of Global Affairs at the Monk School of International Affairs at University of Toronto, and he has a a question now to pose concerning Canada's role. Pitasanna, please continue.
Thank you, Ray, for speaking with us today. Humanity will eventually overcome the present global threat of the coronavirus pandemic. However, on the issue of tackling the threat of nuclear weapons, the Justin Trudeau government has consistently opposed efforts to prohibit and eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons. Canada refused to join 122 countries represented at the 2017 conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. In December 2018, Canada voted against a UN General Assembly resolution for strengthening Russia and United States compliance with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Pierre Trudeau, in contrast to his son, called for suffocating the nuclear arms race. Pierre Trudeau's government in 1974 voted in favor of UN General Assembly Resolution 3263, calling for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. However, the Justin Trudeau government has refused to call on Israel, the only nuclear power in the region, to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, if signed by Israel, would significantly work to achieve the goal of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, which Canada previously proclaimed to support. Can you talk about why the Justin Trudeau government refuses to commit towards efforts in prohibiting and eliminating the threat of nuclear weapons? And what can Canadians do to compel the Trudeau government to change course and support efforts to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, really great question. Part of the opposition to the nuclear ban, or to really any progressive policy changes regarding nuclear weapons, is fear of the United States. They've put a lot of pressure on NATO allies not to join, and we may not know the extent of that pressure or the threats that have been made to Canada specifically. But we know that that is definitely an element in their decision not to join. But part of it, and the part that we can really focus on, is the current Liberal Party's philosophy around militarism more broadly. It's increasing the military budget. It's trying to invest in the new fighter jets, which so many of you have been active in trying to prevent, doing really great campaigning work. And this really relates to overall ideas about security and about militarism and about Canada's position in the world. You know, for Canada as a NATO member, this involves nuclear weapons. Its position in the world is being a supporter of nuclear weapons. And at the UN First Committee, about a week and a half ago, Canada said that it supports and understands the need for nuclear deterrence. This is, I don't know how many times they've actually explicitly said that before in the UN. And I think it really needs to be called out because it goes beyond its usual more tacit support, saying we're a NATO member, blah, 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 to an active endorsement of nuclear weapons and of nuclear deterrence. And it's completely at odds with Canada's stated commitment to nuclear disarmament. And it's just, you know, it's very, there's a double speak to it, because in the one breath, the second part of that sentence was, well, the first part was we support and understand the need for nuclear deterrence, but we will continue to tirelessly work for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Well, those two things are completely counter to each other. You cannot hold those two ideas in your head at the same time. Either you believe nuclear deterrence works and therefore you support nuclear weapons, or you think there should be the elimination of nuclear weapons. So this doublespeak is incredibly frustrating. And I think it has to be continuously challenged by all of us. It can be really confusing, but also comforting for people to hear the government say, we support practical measures for nuclear disarmament, and we've been working for so long on getting a fissile material treaty and entry into force of the test ban treaty and these other things. But the public has no idea that these measures have actually, they've been, you know, worked for 25 years without any progress. And that's really hard to get across to the general public, the nuances of what that actually means by practical measures versus the ban. So a few ideas are really that I think are important to take up is using the stated desire of this current government for feminist foreign policy. I think it's really important to hammer them about the inconsistency of feminism and nuclear weapons. I think also as much as we can do to educate the public that Canada actually helped build nuclear weapons is really important. I think a lot of us don't know that and don't have that in our history, that we were not passive observers. We were very closely and intimately involved in that project. And also the impacts that this had on First Nations community in particular related to uranium mining. And I think we can put that in the context of healing the settler states' relationship with First Nations, which is another, stated claim of the Trudeau government that he's committed to do, but massively failing at, especially with everything that we've seen going on right now and across Canada with our Indigenous nations. So framing nuclear abolition as an issue of decolonization and correcting these historic mistakes of the settler state, I think is useful for a lot of activists who maybe aren't working on nuclear weapons, but aren't familiar with this history, but would really care about this connection. And I think it would help really advance the shifting narratives and understandings going on right now. Trudeau, as we all know, cares about PR more than pretty much anything else, as far as I can tell. So I think making it a real nightmare for him to be seen as someone who loves nuclear weapons might be a reasonable approach. I feel like I've been talking to Global Affairs Canada, and I know many of you and many others have been doing it even longer than me. And I feel like we have the same conversations with the Canadian government about nuclear weapons. And it's been really difficult under the Trudeau government to advance anything reasonable. They just rely on their usual talking points. And so part of me wonders if it's just, time to adopt a really simple public narrative about nuclear weapons that really ties Trudeau's position as being he supports nuclear weapons. He loves the bomb, and that's his position, and making the treaty a question of are you for nuclear weapons or are you against them? It's time to draw that line and make up your mind, and where are we going to stand as a country? And I don't normally necessarily, I appreciate nuance. I'm, part of the global diplomatic debate that happens all the time at the NPT and at the UN. But I think in this case with this particular prime minister, who's so responsive really to PR more than anything else, that might be an approach worth considering.
Thank you, Pitasanna and Ray. We now have a whole list of questions from the audience. So I'd like to pose some of these questions. Jonathan actually asked you a question, Ray, which relates to what you just said. That is, he wanted to know how the Canadian government could be influenced to actually ratify the treaty. But he also asked this question that wasn't directly answered yet: can Canada join the treaty and remain a member of NATO?
Yes, Canada can join the treaty and remain a member of NATO. Personally, I would like Canada to withdraw from NATO, and I would like to see NATO abolished. So don't misunderstand me there. That's my position. But Canada can absolutely join and remain part of NATO. They can withdraw from NATO's nuclear war planning group, of which, yes, there is one. They can renounce nuclear weapons and say that they do not condone any use of nuclear weapons by NATO or the inclusion of nuclear weapons in NATO's strategic doctrine, and they can work with other NATO states that are opposed to nuclear weapons to remove it from the strategic doctrine. I think it's really important to remember that nuclear weapons were not included in the NATO doctrine from the beginning. They were added much more recently. And so they can absolutely be removed from the treaty alliance. And so Canada can work for that within NATO, but in the meantime, have its own policy that it won't participate in any planning to use or use of nuclear weapons, and then it rejects and renounces nuclear deterrence. So that's what we're trying to advocate for a number of NATO countries that we're trying to get support for the treaty.
Thank you. Leah asked a very basic question, and one which we should provide a good answer to. What are some good introductory resources for people who are new to nuclear abolition and want to learn more? I mean, I guess one answer I could give to that myself is that at the scienceforpeace.ca website, there is a resources section and a subcategory of nuclear weapons, and there are a number of good sources. However, as well, Melissa, would you note down Aliyah's email address so we can send her some further sources to read up on nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, Ellie has an interesting question with quite wide ramifications. What would or wouldn't change with a change of regime in the US?
Unfortunately, not enough would change with our current options. If Bernie was still in the mix, we'd be having a different conversation. But if the government changes, and let's hope that it does, I think that we will see a return to Obama-era policies on nuclear weapons. So I don't think it will have an impact on modernization of nuclear weapons. I think that will continue full steam ahead because that was the plan set out by the Obama administration, not by Bush and not by Trump, but by his administration. I think that we would likely see an extension of New START, the bilateral arms control agreement with Russia, which is currently under discussion and is the last remaining arms control treaty that we have between those two countries, and really legally the only remaining needle in the haystack, that once that's pulled out, there are no legal constraints on the arms race, which is already ongoing. I mean, let's face it, people warn about the impending arms race. No, we're in an arms race. That's happening right now. They're investing billions and billions of dollars every year in nuclear weapons. But in terms of the number, the size of the arsenals, and the configurations for deployments and things like that, it's the last constraint. So I do think that a Biden administration would renew that and possibly also extend it. I think, when it comes to this question about that the current US administration is really pushing for, which is for China to join trilateral arms control agreements. I don't know what the new administration, a different administration, would push for there, but would probably not be so heavy-handed about it, in the sense of threatening basically to not extend New START unless China joins and things like that. So I think that, there would be a little bit more room to maneuver in that regard as well. Would a new administration under current options lead to the US joining the nuclear ban? I mean, it seems very unlikely to me. On the other hand, having the space for more public engagement on that issue, I think could lead to changes in US policies on nuclear weapons. And I find it really hard to talk about predictions of things because I think things can change very rapidly due to unforeseen circumstances. And so pretty much anything is possible, I think. So I'm definitely not someone that says, oh, this or that government will never join this treaty, or will never dismantle nuclear weapons or anything. I think anything is possible.
Thank you. There are an amazing number of very good questions here. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of them. Daniela poses two questions. She makes the point that the Canadian public is largely unaware of what is going on to do with the UN treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and unaware about Canada's potential role in ratifying that treaty. So she asks, what initiatives can we take regarding Canada's refusal to sign the nuclear weapons ban make this more visible in the Canadian media so that people are aware that the Canadian government is actually not coming on board with this treaty. Now, I might just add the second one she asked is there a connection between the nuclear power industry in Canada or industries and the Canadian government's position on refusing to ratify the nuclear weapons ban?
On the first question, I think, one thing that's been really interesting over the last, say, year, maybe 2 years, has been the campaign in Canada to call out Canada's arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and framing that around the Trudeau administration's finally getting around to ratifying the arms trade treaty and then immediately violating the arms trade treaty by continuing its sales, or actually resuming its sales to Saudi Arabia. And there's been a lot of really interesting public actions, a lot of which has had to be moved online, of course, since the pandemic. But there's also been media interest in it, and a really committed journalist at the Globe and Mail asking the hard questions and keeping this story out there. And every time that a Canadian weapon ends up in a conflict, really raising hell about it. So I think finding journalists that are willing to do the same thing around the nuclear weapons question is really important. Tying it into the things that I mentioned earlier around our history with the bomb, our so-called feminist foreign policy, these broader things around Canada's arms sales, as well as the investments in the military jets, bringing all these things together and really doing targeted work with the media on this, I think is really important. And doing PR stunts and banner drops and things like that can garner attention, I think is really important. Doing this kind of why does Trudeau love nuclear bombs so much type approach. And then on the nuclear power industry, there's probably people within the Science for Peace network that are much better placed than me to answer that. But I mean, the whole everything that has to do with corporate involvement in terms of, subsidiaries of Lockheed Martin and the weapons producers being in Canada, and the investments in the national narrative and in the national economy around nuclear power absolutely has an impact on the government's policies. The state is quite captured by corporate interests. We can see this across every issue. So I definitely think that's going to be part of the equation as well.
Thank you. Barbara asked, at the moment, the whole world is fighting an epidemic. Can we use this worldview and unity and apply it to nuclear abolition?
Yeah, the UN General Assembly is quite interesting in this. The Security Council has been in complete disarray since the beginning of the pandemic. Just for a while, they just utterly collapsed. And they've been unable to really respond to anything. Whereas the General Assembly has really taken up this message of global unity, solidarity, making sure that everybody has access to healthcare. And when the General Assembly adopted its resolution on COVID-19, only the US and Israel voted against it. So this isn't to say that every other country in the world is handling the pandemic perfectly. That's obviously not true. But the message coming out of the majority of countries, also at the UN General Assembly high-level debate this year, which took place online for the first time ever, was really about this unity and global cooperation and care for each other and for the planet. And so I think the treaty is absolutely part of that spirit. It is also a product of the UN General Assembly. That's where it was negotiated and adopted. And I think it really speaks to the power of that forum as a collective body, but it also speaks to, the treaty speaks to the ability of so-called unimportant states, which the past Swedish foreign minister actually called all the countries who supported the ban, that they were insignificant countries. Which is amazing, because it's offensive to all small countries, which have an equal say in everything that happens in the world. But also, it's like Brazil and Indonesia and all these countries are supportive of the ban. It makes no sense. But anyway, it really shows how these countries, which do hold some commitments globally, at least at the multilateral level, to advance laws and advance norms in spite of the threats of the nuclear armed states. And I think that lesson is good for us to hold on to during the pandemic, during the coming climate crisis, which is only going to get worse and worse as time goes on, that there are ways in which the rest of the world can circumnavigate some of these powers. And I think over time, we'll see a fundamental shift in how international relations operate.
Thank you. Louis has an interesting question to ask, which would not have occurred to me, but I see the force of it. He asks, in a world where all nuclear weapons would be eliminated, what would we do with the know-how, that is, the capability to rebuild weapons in a matter of perhaps weeks? See, that would be a continuing problem.
Yes, but I think it's important to recognize that this is a problem for anything, right? There's this sort of magic that's suggested around nuclear weapons. We can't put the nuclear genie back in the bottle, and that kind of thing, which is true. It's not like we're going to collectively eliminate that knowledge from the world, but that's true of any problem or any material object that we created that we no longer use or that has been banned or prohibited and eliminated. So I think we have to remember that we do this, we can do this. And I think, with any of the treaties that have been generated for dealing with sort of nuclear governance, if you want to call it that, whether it's the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the International Atomic Energy Safeguard System and additional protocol, as well as the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, they all have and will have verification measures and monitoring capacities and things like that. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is still not entered into force, nevertheless set up monitoring stations around the world, which is how we know anytime a nuclear weapon test occurs. And so we have the technological know-how also to solve the problems that we've created, other than the problem of nuclear waste, which is going to be a problem that lasts with us forever. And we didn't fix that one before generating it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Matthew has asked a couple of questions, actually three, but they all relate to a similar theme. And that is Matthew is from the United States. He's concerned that the military-industrial complex in the United States is incredibly powerful. And he wonders how in the world the anti-nuclear movement deal with this entrenched military-industrial complex, which actually might be called the military-industrial security complex, since it also include homeland security and ICE and border immigration authorities, border control as well. In other words, this is a very powerful block, enormous. I mean, as we know, the military budget in the United States this year is $775 billion. So he asked, how do we deal with this? How can it be dealt with?
Mm-hmm. It's a really great question, one that I think we would need hours to discuss. But I think, in short, one thing that works somewhat to our advantage is exactly what you point out. All of these companies are working on all of the violent things in the United States. So even my mind has been blown recently to learn that Sandia National Laboratory, which is one of the nuclear weapon laboratories in New Mexico, was the first government agency commissioned in the Bush era after 9/11 to come up with the plan for securing the southern border with Mexico. And so it was a nuclear weapon lab that was devising the plan for building the wall, and it contracted with Boeing, which is, you might think makes planes, but actually also makes nuclear bombs and makes all kinds of weapons for the US military and to sell to militaries around the world. But it was then contracted to actually build some of the surveillance equipment for the border wall. And we can also see then how this is connected to the police. A lot of the same companies that are making weapons for sale abroad or for US wars are also then being brought back to US domestic police forces. And we're seeing the ways in which drones that are operated by Customs and Border Protection are being used to surveil activists in Portland. Most recently, they were the same drones being used to surveil the Standing Rock camp against the oil pipeline. And so there's the ways in which these corporations are involved in all of these nefarious things happening can work to our advantage, because we can see that we can target Boeing, we can target Lockheed Martin, we can target Raytheon, BlackRock, we can target these investors and these producers of weapons, and really use the force of stigmatization, bringing all of our movements together to do that, so that it's not just the anti-nuclear movement or the anti-war movement or the police abolition movement, but we could all work together on the corporate angle of the structures of violence. So I think that that is really key. And then, of course, divestment, which I already talked about, is another thing, another element of this. But I do think that corporations are one of the biggest impediments to peace. And this has been true forever. You know, in Wilkes' founding resolution in 1915, it cited the private profits accrued from militarization and war as being the main impediment to peace. So this has been a persistent problem that we really need to deal with.
Thank you. I might also mention that in the winter term, Science for Peace has a series on overcoming the climate crisis, and two of the webinars relate to the whole issue of coalition building and the complementarities among various single issue social movements. So the idea that it should only be peace warriors who deal with nuclear weapons issues is simply self-defeating. It needs to be a much larger movement, and it can be, because the very close complementarities between, for example, peace and the climate. Having said that, I'd now like to return to a question by, it disappeared actually. By Adnan. Yes, Adnan wants to return to the issue of Canada's role and how we can persuade the Canadian government to ratify the UN treaty. And Adnan wonders if the Trudeau government could be persuaded in terms of how badly nuclear weapons and nuclear war affect women and children at large, since women and children are a major concern, priority of the Trudeau government. Adnan points out that he sees that in NATO, there are many women and security conferences that gain the support of women, so that there is quite a large constituency in NATO concerned with role of women and children and the impact of nuclear weapons. I don't know if you have any comment on that, Ray.
Yeah, I think this fits with the broader approach about the pursuit of a feminist foreign policy as well, which unfortunately in Canada has really been this patronizing international aid sort of focused outreach. It hasn't really to date been about foreign policy. It's been about international aid and about empowering women and girls and that kind of thing, which is not to say that that's bad or anything like that, but it's been interesting to see how it has and hasn't worked. And there's been some really good critical work done around what Canada's feminist international aid has actually meant for women around the world. So I think bringing those critiques into those spaces and looking at then the ways that if you're saying this is what you're doing, then you also need to take nuclear weapons into account. And just in case anybody's unfamiliar with this, there's been a number of studies now that have shown that ionizing radiation has a different impact on women and girls than it does on others. And so if you're interested in that, genderandradiation.org is kind of the primary place to look for information. And so this is reflected in the treaty that there's a differential disproportionate impact in this way. But also in the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, there's an explicit call to increase the number of women that are participating in nuclear weapon discussions and debates and negotiations. So, pointing out these particular provisions of the treaty, along with all of its other provisions, I think could be helpful in those spaces for sure.
Thank you. Now, Nathan has a very long comment and then questions. I won't read the whole comment, but I will read his very enthusiastic first words. Thanks, Ray. ICANN, RCW, and WILPF rock. Okay, so that's the very enthusiastic part of the very long comment. But basically, down below, he's pointing out that the emerging great power rivalries between the United States and China are very clear in the past few years. So this growing rivalry between these two great powers, he asks, what challenges does this rivalry pose to the vision of a world without nuclear weapons?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It sort of provides us with the clear dichotomy of the world that we could have, and that the majority of countries in the world are actively trying to build by creating this new kind of international law through the treaty, and the world that the certain heavily militarized countries of the world are trying to preserve, which is where they dominate and they fight it out with their weapons, and the extreme elite within those countries profit from the system while everyone else suffers, which we can see very clearly and starkly during this pandemic of where has all the money gone? Why does the US, for example, have more nuclear warheads than it does hospitals, which is a true statistic? And so we can see in this rivalry that the US is very actively pursuing with China is clearly an attempt to hold on to this world order that benefits the elite within these countries. And it's interesting in that context to view comments from China, which is, it's very difficult to understand a lot of the time what the actual position is, because it's so opaque. But, China on Twitter, the government said that it welcomed the 50th ratification of the TPNW, and that it is going to, it's actively pursuing trying to achieve nuclear abolition, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, China has, hundreds of nuclear weapons and is certainly not going to get rid of them. It says also in the same breath, if the US and Russia still have them. So it's not actually committed to nuclear abolition in that same way. So it's rhetoric, but it's interesting how it's like positioning itself as diametrically opposed to the US in the rhetoric, which has been trying to shut the treaty down. China's saying, oh, it's open to embracing it. And so I think, what does that mean for the way that the rest of the world can maneuver around these two, and if you include Russia, three very extremely dangerous actors in the world who are risking all of our lives by their global conflicts and their power plays with each other? How can we use their own rhetoric back against them? How can we circumnavigate them to create the structures and prevent the worst of the dangers that they're imposing? And hopefully we can do that and help de-escalate the situation in a way that saves humanity. But can we? I don't know. That's up to all of us, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. No, we don't have time for any more questions. And I would like to apologize to the many people whose questions are still outstanding here. I mean, there's some very interesting ones here, which I really would like to pose, but we did say we'd stop at 3 p.m. And I did want to mention before we leave that on November the 19th, we have our second linked webinar, which is on Canadian efforts to try and get Canada to actually ratify the UN treaty. And our speaker at that time will be Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow. And as well, there'll be several members of parliament who are going to talk about what kind of campaign would actually lead to the Canadian government ratifying the UN treaty. So please stay tuned for the November 19th webinar. So let me just end by thanking the Ray for a very, very busy schedule, for taking this hour with us and answering a whole range of very complex and difficult questions in a clear and open manner. It's really wonderful to have that kind of knowledge and to be able to convey it to a larger audience. And also to our three panelists who each posed a very striking question. So thank you very much to all of you, and we'll see you in about a month. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.